I have worked as a nanny for many years. I've taken care of all kinds of children, from the most mischievous to the calmest, and over the years I've had so many experiences that I could fill a book with them. However, there is one in particular that I've never been able to forget, and not because it was one of the most difficult or dangerous, but because it touched me on a very personal level. One of those experiences that marks you deeply, and that no matter how hard you try, you can't leave behind. This story began on a day like any other. I had been recommended to a family who lived in a quiet neighborhood here in Mexico. They had said they were looking for someone reliable, someone who could take care of their son while they worked, as their jobs didn't allow them to be home most of the time. It was normal in this kind of job. I was already used to dealing with the complicated schedules of busy parents. What I didn't expect was the feeling of discomfort that invaded me from the moment I set foot in that house. When I arrived for the first time, the mother greeted me somewhat formally, distantly. She seemed kind, but there was something in her demeanor that felt cold to me, as if she were doing me a favor by hiring me, even though it was obvious they needed my help. She explained the basic tasks, like any other family would. The boy, whom we'll call Lautaro, was 9 years old. He was very quiet and didn't usually cause problems. He spends a lot of time in his room. He likes to be alone, she told me. Those words stuck with me from the very beginning, not because they were unusual in themselves, but because of the way she said them. It wasn't a simple description of an introverted child's habits. It sounded more like a warning, as if she were preparing me for something she didn't want to or couldn't fully explain. Lautaro's parents were almost never home. The mother traveled constantly for work, and the father, although I didn't see him on that first visit, worked long hours. This meant that Lautaro was mostly alone. I would be the only company he had for the majority of the day. Up to that point, everything seemed normal, but upon meeting Lautaro, that feeling of unease grew. He was a small boy, with dark hair and large eyes, but what struck me most were how lifeless his eyes seemed. From the first moment, I realized something wasn't right. He didn't play, didn't laugh, barely spoke. When I tried to interact with him, he simply ignored me or responded with monosyllables. Sometimes not even that. He would spend hours lying on his bed, staring at the ceiling, as if there was nothing in the world that could interest him. At first, I thought maybe he was just a reserved, shy child who needed time to get used to a new nanny. But as the days went by, I realized that what was happening with Lautaro went far beyond shyness. There was something in him, something dark, a sadness that didn't match that of a child his age. I became increasingly concerned, but Lautaro's parents seemed indifferent. They told me he had always been like that it was just a phase. But I knew there was something more. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it. It was the same intuition that had made me feel uncomfortable from the beginning. As time went on, I tried everything to get Lautaro to open up. I brought him books, games, tried to distract him with movies or anything that might spark his interest, but nothing worked. He rejected or ignored everything I offered. He remained that silent child, always lying in his bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, as if the world around him didn't exist. Despite his constant rejections, I couldn't help but feel a deep concern for him. There was something in his behavior that seemed too familiar to me, as if I were reliving something I had already seen before, in someone close to me. Maybe that's why it affected me so much. There was something in that loneliness that reminded me of myself as a child, of those moments when you feel invisible, as if the world keeps turning while you sink into a void. One day, while I was in the kitchen preparing dinner, I decided to talk to his parents. I needed to know more. Something inside me told me that I had to understand what was really happening with Lautaro. I asked them if they had noticed anything strange about him, if they had ever spoken to a psychologist, or if something had happened that might have affected his behavior. The mother, as always, responded with a coldness that baffled me. She said Lautaro had always been a different child, that he liked being alone and that they didn't see it as a problem. It's just his way, she told me. But for me, that wasn't enough. I couldn't understand how parents could be so distant from their own child, how they could overlook the fact that their son was completely disconnected from the world around him. I wondered if they had ever taken the time to look him in the eyes, to try to understand what was going on in his mind. But I didn't ask any more questions. I knew I wouldn't get answers. From that day on, I decided that, although I couldn't change Lautaro's family situation, I would do everything I could to be there for him. Maybe I couldn't make his parents see him differently, but at least I could be his support, his company. I didn't know if that would be enough, but it was all I could offer. The feeling that something was terribly wrong with Lautaro grew every day, but the moment that made me realize the gravity of the situation happened one afternoon, one that I still cannot erase from my mind. It was a day like any other. I arrived at Lautaro's house early in the morning. The first thing I noticed was that he wasn't in his usual spot in the living room, nor in his room where he usually spent all his time. I called his name, but there was no answer. At first I wasn't too worried. I thought maybe he was playing in some corner of the house or had simply fallen asleep somewhere else. However, the unease began to grow when I checked every corner of the house and there was no sign of him. I headed down the hallway leading to the bathroom, and that's when I noticed the door was closed. I knocked softly, calling his name. There was no answer. Something inside me told me this wasn't just a childish whim, that he wasn't ignoring me like he usually did. I felt a chill run down my spine. I knocked harder, calling his name again, but everything remained silent. I knelt down to look under the door, and what I saw froze my blood. His feet. He was lying on the floor, motionless. An indescribable panic seized me. I tried to open the door, but it was locked from the inside. I screamed his name, pounded on the door with all my strength, but there was no response. At that moment, I knew something very serious had happened. Adrenaline gave me the strength I needed to push against the door with all my weight. The wood slowly gave way until I finally managed to open it. What I saw when I entered is an image I will never be able to erase from my mind. Lautaro was on the bathroom floor, his eyes closed, with white foam coming out of his mouth. His skin was extremely pale, and his body seemed fragile, almost lifeless. In that moment, I felt as if the world stopped. There was a broken bottle of pills scattered on the floor, and I immediately knew he had tried to end his life. I don't remember thinking, I just acted. I turned his body to the side, just as I had learned in the first aid courses I had taken years ago. As I did so, my hands trembled uncontrollably. I called the emergency number with my other hand, praying they would arrive in time. The ambulance arrived within minutes, though for me, those moments felt like an eternity. The paramedics worked quickly to stabilize Lautaro. I watched in shock, unable to take my eyes off his small body, wondering how things had gotten to this point. How was it possible that a boy of only 9 years old could make such an extreme decision? When they finally loaded him into the ambulance, I went with them to the hospital. Throughout the ride, I couldn't stop thinking about what had gone wrong, about how I hadn't seen the signs earlier. Tears streamed down my face, but at that moment I didn't care. All I wanted was for Lautaro to survive, to have a second chance. At the hospital, they took him straight to the emergency room. I stayed in the waiting room, unable to move, unable to think clearly. I felt empty, guilty, as if somehow I had failed to protect him. The hours I spent in the waiting room were the longest and most terrifying of my life. I sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, my hands clasped together, and my heart beating at a frantic pace. I couldn't stop replaying the events of that morning over and over again, searching for any detail I might have missed, something I could have done to prevent what had happened. As I waited, Lautaro's parents arrived. His mother walked in with a look of disbelief and panic on her face. When I saw them, I quickly stood up, but I didn't know what to say. How could I explain what had happened when I barely understood it myself? Lautaro's mother approached me and, with a trembling voice, asked me what had happened. I told them what little I knew, my voice shaky and my eyes filled with tears. I explained how I had found him in the bathroom, how I had called the ambulance. As I spoke, I saw how Lautaro's mother's expression changed from panic to overwhelming pain. I couldn't help but feel immense sadness for her. No matter how distant she had been with her son, no one deserves to go through something like this. Lautaro's father, on the other hand, remained silent. His jaw clenched and his hands balled into fists. He seemed angry, but not with me, rather with the situation, with the helplessness of not having been there to prevent it. Hours passed before a doctor finally came out to speak with us. The doctor's face was serious, but at least he didn't bring the worst news we feared. He told us that Lautaro was stable, although still under observation. He had taken a large amount of clonazepam, but thanks to the quick intervention, his life was no longer in danger. When I heard those words, I felt immense relief, but also deep sadness. Lautaro had survived, yes, but what had brought him to this point? How could such a young boy come to the conclusion that the only way out was to end his life? Those questions kept hammering in my mind. After speaking with the doctor, Lautaro's parents went to be by his side. I offered to accompany them, but his mother, with tear-reddened eyes, told me they preferred to be alone with their son at that moment. I understood perfectly. So I stayed in the waiting room, not knowing what to do, feeling completely useless. It was at that moment that the police officers arrived. The police didn't take long to show up at the hospital. They wanted answers, just like all of us. They asked me about what had happened, about my relationship with Lautaro and his parents, and about any details that might help clarify how things had gotten to this point. I answered their questions as best as I could, though I had many more questions than answers myself. I told them what little I knew, how I had found Lautaro, the pills on the bathroom floor, and the broken bottle I had seen next to him. I explained that I had never seen signs of physical abuse or direct neglect, but that I had always felt something was wrong in that house. I mentioned how Lautaro was always alone, how his parents were distant, and how he seemed shut off, as if the world made no sense to him. The interrogation lasted hours. They wanted to know everything, from my daily routine with Lautaro to any strange conversations I might have had with his parents. It was exhausting, and although I understood they were just doing their job, I couldn't help but feel suffocated by the pressure. I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow I had failed, as if I could have done more to prevent this from happening. When they finally finished, one of the police officers, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, looked at me and said softly, "You did everything you could, it's not your fault." But those words didn't bring me comfort. In my heart, I still felt I could have done more, that I should have seen the signs earlier. Several days passed before Lautaro fully woke up. During that time, the doctors and psychologists kept him under constant observation. The hospital treated his case as an attempted suicide, although his parents were reluctant to accept that reality. They struggled to believe their son had reached such an extreme point. What they didn't understand was that Lautaro's pain went far beyond what they could see. Finally, there was a day when Lautaro and I were alone in his hospital room. He had been very quiet as usual, but that afternoon I noticed something different in his expression. His eyes no longer seemed so empty, though they were still filled with sadness. He looked at me, and for the first time since I had known him, he spoke to me in a way that seemed more sincere, more real. "Lautaro," I said softly, "if you need to talk, I'm here. You don't have to carry everything on your own." At first he didn't respond. I thought that, like so many other times, he would shut down and say nothing. But to my surprise, after a long silence, he looked me in the eyes and said in a low voice, "I did it because I can't take it anymore." I felt my heart stop when I heard those words. I tried to stay calm so as not to scare him, but inside I was breaking. "What is it that you can't take anymore?" I asked carefully, trying not to push him too hard. Lautaro looked at me with those eyes full of sadness and pain and finally opened up to me. He told me that at his new school he had been a victim of bullying from day one. The other kids insulted him, hit him, humiliated him daily. They made him feel less than, made him feel like he was worthless. Over time, he began to believe them. Every day that passed, he felt his life getting darker, more unbearable. He hadn't told his parents because he thought they wouldn't believe him, or worse, that they wouldn't care. "They're not here for me," he said with a trembling voice. "They never have been." I was speechless. Tears filled my eyes as I listened to him speak. That such a young child could carry so much pain and loneliness broke my heart. But at the same time, I felt immense relief because he had finally spoken. At least now I knew what had brought him to that extreme, and although I didn't have all the answers, I knew we could start helping him. After that conversation, I spoke with Lautaro's parents and the hospital psychologist. I told them what Lautaro had confessed to me, though it was hard for them to accept. They didn't want to believe their son had reached the point of attempting suicide because he felt completely alone and abandoned. But over time, and after many conversations with the professionals, they began to understand the magnitude of the problem. Lautaro was transferred to a new school, and his parents started to get more involved in his life, although it took them time to adjust to this new reality. They knew they had to make changes, not just in Lautaro's environment, but also in the way they were present for him. It wasn't easy, but at least now they were trying to do something. Over the following months, Lautaro began to show signs of improvement. He was no longer the completely shut-down child I had met. He started to smile again from time to time, and although he still had bad days in general, his mental health began to improve. He continued to attend therapy sessions, and little by little he began to open up more to his family and the people around him. Several years have passed since that terrible day when I found Lautaro in the bathroom, but his story remains present in my mind. I can't help but think about how close he came to losing his life, about how a decision driven by pain could have ended in tragedy. But I also think about his recovery, about how, despite everything, he managed to move forward. Today, Lautaro is a teenager, and although he still faces challenges, he has become a strong and resilient young man. Seeing him smile, seeing him interact with other kids, fills me with a joy I can't describe. I know the wound from that day will always be there, but I also know we've come a long way since then. For me, this experience changed me profoundly. I realized how fragile we are, how pain can consume us if we don't find a way to express it. I learned that sometimes the most important thing we can do for someone is simply to be there, to listen, and to make sure they're not alone. This story isn't just about Lautaro. It's about all the children who silently suffer without anyone noticing. I hope we can be more attentive, more willing to listen, because sometimes what they need most is someone to tell them that everything will be okay. And although it took me time to process everything I experienced with Lautaro, today I can say that helping him out of that dark place gave me a peace I never thought I would find. Well, I don't even know where to start. What I'm about to tell you still gives me goosebumps every time I think about it, and it's hard for me to even talk about it out loud. It's like reliving it would open a door I'd rather keep shut, you know? But anyway, here it goes. It all started when I lost my job. It wasn't anything unusual. You know how things are. Sometimes you're lucky, sometimes you're not. So since I couldn't find anything, I started looking for any kind of work I could do. And that's when this family came into my life. A family that had just moved into the neighborhood. Honestly, I never paid much attention to them before all this. I knew there was a new couple on the block, but they weren't the kind of neighbors who greet you or chat with you. I would see them leave together in their car, but always alone, never with a child or anything like that. One day, while I was bored and checking my phone, I saw that someone had posted a WhatsApp status looking for a nanny. It didn't say much, something like, "We're looking for a nanny for a few days, good pay." And my first thought was, perfect. Just what I need. I had never been a nanny professionally, but I had taken care of my nieces and nephews a few times and got along well with them, so I figured it would be a piece of cake. I replied to the message, and it wasn't long before they responded. The woman, I can't remember if she told me her full name, invited me to her house the next day for an interview. I arrived on time, ringing the doorbell nervously but excited. The door opened quickly, and there she was with one of those smiles that seem friendly but don't reach the eyes, you know? Like she was acting. But at the time, I didn't see it that way. I smiled back, and she invited me in. The house, well, it was a normal house like any other in our neighborhood. Maybe a bit bigger, but nothing out of the ordinary. Except for the silence. It was really weird because you expect to hear noise, right? If you have a kid at home, they're usually playing, shouting, or watching TV. But no, nothing. The house was in an almost eerie silence. The woman led me to the living room, and we started talking about the job. She told me they had a son, but that he was napping at the moment, that he was a very quiet but somewhat shy boy. She explained that I wouldn't have to do much. Just keep him entertained for a while in the afternoons, give him a snack, and put him to bed. She told me the pay was more than generous, almost too good to be true, but I didn't question it. I needed the money. After that talk, she gave me a tour of the house. Everything seemed in order, nothing out of the ordinary. Except, I never saw the kid. He was sleeping, and although I didn't want to be suspicious, it seemed strange not to hear a single sound. But I let it go. Who was I to say how a child should behave, right? The first day on the job was when things started to get really strange. I arrived as usual, and the mother, with that same odd smile, greeted me at the door. This time, she told me her husband was at work, and that she was leaving me alone with the boy. "He's in his room," she said. "You can go meet him." And that's when I saw him for the first time, or at least I saw what I thought was a child. The room was small, with a child-sized bed and toys scattered everywhere, but what unsettled me was what I saw on the bed. He was sitting there, cross-legged, but his posture was odd. He was sitting up too straight, too stiffly for a 5- or 6-year-old. At first I didn't notice too much, but something about his face seemed strange. He had big eyes, but they didn't have the usual innocence of a child. No, they were eyes that watched me, analyzed me, as if they were evaluating my every move. "Hi," I said, trying to sound calm, though I already had a knot in my stomach. He didn't respond, just stared at me. He smiled, but that smile gave me chills. I tried to break the ice, asked if he wanted to play something, but he remained silent. Then, in that moment, with a high-pitched, broken voice, as if it was forced, he said, "Let's play hide and seek." It seemed odd to me. Not that kids don't play hide and seek, but his tone, the way he said it. Something was wrong. I couldn't shake that strange feeling in my chest, like I was getting involved in something I didn't understand. "Sure," I replied, trying to sound cheerful. "Who hides first?" He jumped off the bed, but the way he moved was odd, as if he was too coordinated for his age. What I couldn't stop noticing were how big his hands seemed. Everything about him was disproportionate, like his body was struggling to fit into something that didn't belong to him. But I let it go. I thought maybe I was overreacting, letting my imagination get the best of me. We started the game. He asked me to count to 10 and he ran down the hallway. I heard him move, but there was something strange about the sound of his footsteps, like they weren't the light steps of a child, but rather those of someone heavy, with more strength than he should have had. I started looking for him around the house, and when I got to the closet in his room, I found him there, hiding. But he wasn't crouched like a child would be. He was standing, upright, staring at me with those cold eyes. "You found me," he said, but his voice had changed. It wasn't high-pitched or childlike anymore, it was deeper, more adult. That's when I knew. He wasn't a child. I tried to stay calm. I nervously smiled and said something like, "Well, your turn to count," trying to make everything seem normal. Though inside, I was starting to feel fear creeping through my body. He didn't move. He just kept staring at me, and that smile wasn't a kid's smile. It was like he was enjoying my discomfort. When I finally backed toward the door, he started moving slowly, as if he knew I had already figured it out. I felt something was terribly wrong, and I regretted not listening to my gut from the start. I left the room as quickly as I could, but when I turned to look back, I found him in the hallway, standing right behind me, staring at me, as if he was waiting for me to do something. I won't lie to you, at that moment all I wanted was to run out of that house, but I couldn't do it, obviously. I don't know if you've ever felt that sensation. Like something bad is about to happen, but you don't know exactly what. That feeling seeped into my bones. My hands started sweating, my heart was pounding, and every fiber of my being was telling me I needed to leave right away. But it wasn't that simple. The guy, no, I can't keep calling him a kid because he wasn't, was still there, standing, staring at me with that unsettling expression. He was smiling, but not like kids smile, not with joy or innocence. It was a calculated smile, one that seemed rehearsed 1,000 times. He was too still, and that made me more uneasy than anything. No one can be that still without something going on in their mind. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but the truth was all I wanted was to run for the door. He didn't respond, just kept staring at me. He seemed to be waiting for something. That's when I heard a noise behind me, a faint thump coming from the other side of the house. I quickly turned around but didn't see anything. It must be the mother, she must be back, I thought. And in part I felt relieved because I didn't want to be alone with that guy any longer. I made up a quick excuse, something like I needed to use the bathroom. I don't know why I said that, it was the first thing that came to mind. He didn't say anything, just followed me with his eyes as I walked away. I headed down the hallway, and instead of going to the bathroom, I went straight for the front door. My idea was to leave, to get out without saying anything. Something inside me was telling me I wasn't safe there. But when I grabbed the doorknob and tried to turn it, I realized the door was locked. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. I looked for the key everywhere, in the drawers near the entrance, on the little table in the foyer, but there was no sign of it. Looking for something? I heard his voice behind me. It was him, standing in the hallway, watching me with that same expression that chilled my blood. Now his voice sounded more like a man's, deep and firm. That's when I knew, without a doubt, that I was in trouble. I tried not to look scared. "Oh yeah, I was just looking for the keys because I think I left something in the car," I lied. But he didn't believe me. I could see it in his eyes. He seemed to be enjoying my fear. He stepped a little closer, his movements slow, as if savoring every second. My whole body was on high alert. I knew I couldn't let him get too close, but I also couldn't let him see how afraid I was. "The keys aren't here," he said, smiling that damn smile. "They're in my parents' room." At that moment, it felt like all the air had been sucked out of my lungs. He wasn't a child, of course not, but the way he said it was like he was playing with me. My instincts were screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. The door was locked, and he was between the door and me. I had no other option. "Oh, okay, I'll go get them then," I said, trying to sound calm. I walked toward the hallway, but this time I went slower, thinking about every step. I knew he was following me. I could feel his eyes on my back. When I reached his parents' room, I tried to open the door, but it was locked too. For a moment, I just stood there, not knowing what to do. I could feel the fear taking over, almost paralyzing me, but I knew I had to stay calm. "Where are your parents?" I asked, trying to buy time. "They'll be back later," he replied, now with a completely different voice, deeper, almost mocking. He was toying with me, and that terrified me. That's when I realized there was no way this family was normal. Something had been wrong from the beginning. It was like I had fallen into a trap, and now I couldn't get out. Somehow I had to find a way to escape before it was too late. I decided to take a risk. If I couldn't get out through the front door, maybe a window would be open. I told him I was going to the bathroom this time, for real, and closed the door behind me. In the bathroom, I tried to calm down, but my hands were shaking. I checked the window. It was closed too, but not locked. I could open it if I found a way to do it without him noticing. I heard footsteps outside the bathroom. He was there, standing, waiting. I didn't have much time. I opened the window as quietly as I could, but just then I heard the doorknob turn. I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I jumped through the window without thinking, landing on my knees on the backyard grass. My heart was beating so fast I thought he could hear it. I ran. I ran like I had never run in my life. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if he was following me. I just kept running until I reached the street, and only then did I dare to turn around. There was no one, but I didn't stop until I got home. When I got home, I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. My hands were shaking so much I could barely get the keys out of my pocket. I was out of danger, or at least that's what I thought. But the fear kept gripping my chest. I couldn't stop looking out the window, expecting to see something, or someone. After a few minutes of standing there, panting with my heart racing, I forced myself to sit on the couch. Everything was spinning. What had just happened? Who was that man? Because now I was completely sure he wasn't a child. All those things that had been warning signs were now clear. How hadn't I seen it before? I don't know if it was the fear or the disbelief, but I was having a hard time processing it. The worst part is, even though I had managed to escape, I didn't feel safe. That smile, the way he had looked at me like he knew I would eventually come back, was still stuck in my mind. Come back? No way, but just the thought that he might know where I lived made me nervous. I had run out without saying anything, without confronting anyone, and I felt completely defenseless. I locked myself in my house for the rest of the day, checking the locks, looking out the windows, waiting to see that family's car drive by. But I didn't see anything. On one hand, that reassured me, but on the other, it unsettled me not to know what they were planning. Were they going to come after me? Did they know where I lived? And what about the mother? She was clearly involved in all this too. They knew. They knew from the beginning. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that image of him, standing in the hallway, staring at me with those eyes that weren't a child's. And that smile. I'll never be able to forget it. At some point in the middle of the night, when I thought I couldn't stand the fear any longer, I decided I had to do something. I couldn't just sit around waiting. The next day, I went straight to the police. I didn't know what I was going to tell them. I was afraid they wouldn't believe me, that they'd think I was crazy. But I needed to do something. I couldn't just sit with my arms crossed. When I arrived at the station, I approached the desk and explained to the officer that there was something weird about the family I was working for as a nanny. I tried to tell them everything that had happened, though I didn't know how to put into words everything I was feeling. Sometimes I would hear myself talk and think I sounded crazy. How was I going to explain that someone who seemed like a child was actually a man with dwarfism, and that they were using him to trap me? The officer looked at me with a mix of skepticism and concern. He took some notes, but it was clear he didn't know whether to believe me. He asked if there had been any violence, any dangerous behavior from them, and the truth was, even though they had given me a terrible feeling, there wasn't anything concrete I could point to. Nothing had really happened. I didn't know if they were planning something or if I had escaped a trap just in time. He asked if I wanted to file an official report, but when I realized how hard it would be to prove everything I had said, I backed out. Report what exactly? That a guy with dwarfism had played hide-and-seek in a way that made me nervous. I knew it sounded absurd. The officer suggested that if anything else happened, or if I received any threats, I should contact them again, but that without evidence or something clearer, they couldn't do much. I left the police station feeling just as vulnerable as when I arrived. As the days went by, I tried to get back to my life. I never saw that family again. In fact, after what happened, it seemed like they had disappeared. The house was still there, of course, but I didn't see the woman or the man leave anymore. Even the cars didn't seem to move from the garage. I rang the doorbell twice and waited for someone to answer the door. I was standing on the front porch of the Peterson family's house. They were relatively new to the neighborhood, having moved in just 2 months ago. During my brief interactions with them, they seemed like friendly and generally pleasant people, typical of an American suburban family. So I wasn't surprised when Mrs. Peterson contacted me to ask if I would be willing to babysit their son for a night. They were offering $100 for it, which is really good money for a 15-year-old girl in my neighborhood, so I didn't hesitate to say yes. Although I had heard around that the boy was a bit troublesome and I had never taken care of a kid before, I thought, come on, he's just a little kid, how hard could it be? Well, I was about to find out soon. The door opened and I was greeted by Mr. and Mrs. Peterson. They invited me inside their home and introduced me to their 8-year-old son, James. Hi, James, I'm Carol, nice to meet you, I said as I shook his hand. He gave me a shy smile and then went back to sitting on the couch to continue playing on his video game console. Mrs. Peterson told me that she and her husband were going to a concert that night and promised to be back before 10 o'clock. Her husband would drive me home when they returned. She had already prepared James's meal and asked me to heat it up in the microwave before serving it to him. She also gave me some money and said I could order whatever I wanted from the local restaurant. Before leaving, Mr. Peterson turned to look at his son and said, "Listen, James, you're going to behave, okay? When we come back, we want Carol to have only good things to say about you, understood?" James nodded and went back to his game. The Petersons said goodbye and left for the concert. Things were quiet for the next 20 minutes. James continued playing while I flipped through a magazine and simultaneously chatted with my friends on my phone. Every now and then I glanced at James to keep an eye on him. He had behaved well so far and was keeping calm. A few more minutes passed when suddenly I heard a small thud. James had casually thrown his console on the floor, then put his legs up on the table in front of him, leaned back on the sofa with his hands behind his head, fingers intertwined. He was staring at me. "I'm bored," he said. I smiled at him and closed my magazine. "Would you like to watch something on TV? Is there a cartoon or anime you like?" I asked. He just kept staring at me while wiggling his toes. "Dance for me," he said. "Excuse me?" I replied, totally caught off guard. "Dance, sing, do whatever you want. Mom and Dad are paying you to be here, aren't they? So go ahead, entertain me," he said. "Little brat, who do you think you are?" I thought to myself. But I couldn't speak to him that way. He was still just a child. "James, didn't your parents teach you to be respectful to adults?" "I don't like the way you've been talking to me," I said. Then I continued. "Now, if you're bored, I can turn on the TV or read you a story from your favorite book." "Boring," he said immediately, looking away. "What would you like to do? Are you hungry? Should I heat up the food your mom prepared?" I asked him. He looked at me and asked, "Do you have a boyfriend?" "No," I replied before I realized it. He smirked arrogantly. "I figured," he said. For the first time, I felt my face flush with anger, and I was trying my hardest to keep my composure. This kid was really getting to me. James got up from his chair and said, "On second thought, I'm hungry. Let's order pizza." He grabbed the cordless phone and started dialing. I got up, walked over to him, and took the phone from his hands. Your mom gave strict instructions not to order food. You'll have to eat what she prepared, I said. I won't, and you can't make me, he replied, ready to throw a tantrum. I picked up my phone and said, I'm going to call your father now. They won't be happy to hear what I have to say. The warning worked. James realized the consequences and finally said, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that. It's okay, James. Now what would you like to eat? Are you hungry? I asked. The boy thought for a moment and then asked, Is it okay if I give you a hug, please? He said, smiling sweetly with his hands clasped together. I smiled and nodded. The boy came over and gave me a warm hug, and then suddenly I felt a sharp pain in my arm. James had bitten me and quickly pulled away while I stood there rubbing my arm in shock. Then he came at me again, and this time he grabbed my phone. He ran to the window and threw it outside. James? I shouted angrily. I opened the front door and looked outside. The phone had fallen into the garden, full of plants and bushes of all kinds. The place was also poorly lit. I turned back toward him angrily. You'd better stay in your place or you'll really regret it, I warned him. He got the message and sat back down in his chair. Then I went out to look for my phone. I was crouching on all fours, searching with my hands in the middle of all that darkness, hoping to find it. A few minutes passed and then I heard the door slam shut. I started to panic and ran toward the door. As I approached the entrance, I heard a loud noise. It wasn't James, it sounded like a much older man. He was inside the house with James, shouting at the top of his lungs, Where's the money, kid? Where did your father hide it? Shut up! Stop crying or I'll hit you if you don't stop now! He roared. I could hear James crying and I began to panic. I started banging on the door. I was really worried about the boy's safety. Please, I don't know anything about that, I heard James respond. Then I heard something crash to the floor, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps inside the house. James was screaming, Help! Someone please help me, please no, let me go, please. James was screaming at the top of his lungs. I started shouting from outside too, while continuing to pound on the door. James, James, I shouted. Suddenly everything went silent, but only for a brief moment. Then I heard another thud at the back of the house. I ran to the back to see what had happened. The back door was open. I cautiously approached the door and looked inside. I couldn't find anyone. Then I ran to the living room. I saw James lying on the floor, beaten in a pool of his own blood. I ran to the boy in absolute panic and turned him over. I couldn't even tell if he was dead or unconscious. I couldn't even check his pulse because my hands were shaking. I got up to look for the phone. I dialed the number to call an ambulance, and then I heard that voice again, this time behind me. I'm going to kill you, it roared. I turned around in absolute terror, thinking this would be the end of me. I realized I was looking at a huge TV screen with the image of an angry man on it. Then the image came to life and the man on the screen started shouting again. Pause. He froze. Play, I'm coming for you, he said. Pause. He froze again. With the phone still pressed to my ear, I slowly turned to look where James was lying on the floor. He was sitting on his knees with the TV remote in his hand and an evil smile on his face. The insufferable brat had been tricking me the whole time. It was all fake. The attack, the cries for help, the blood on his shirt. Everything was fake. Why are you doing this to me? I asked, unable to hide my desperation. Well, I watched Home Alone with my parents last month. I've wanted to try this ever since, he replied. I was struggling to hold back the tears building up inside me, but I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break down. The last thing I needed at that moment was for him to start calling me a crybaby. Deep down, I really, really wanted to slap that brat. Then I heard a knock at the door. Mr. Peterson, is everything okay? I heard a voice from outside. It's Domingo, your neighbor. We heard screams coming from your house, he said. Is everything all right? He asked as he kept knocking on the door. I finally felt a touch of relief. I've known Uncle Domingo since I was a kid, and he's a kind man. I walked to the door and opened it. He was standing there with 3 other people, all with concerned expressions. Carol, what are you doing here? What's going on? He asked. Before I could answer, I saw how his expression changed from confusion to alarm. He burst into the living room. When I turned, I saw James slumped on the couch, unconscious, with bloodstains all over his shirt. Domingo gently patted his cheek, but the boy remained unresponsive. Then he sprinkled some water on his face, and the boy began to slowly regain consciousness. I stood there, stunned, watching as the drama continued to unfold in front of me. Where am I? James asked, trying to appear dazed and confused. You're home, son. Are you okay? What happened? Domingo asked, pointing to his clothes. I stepped forward to answer. Uncle Domingo, everything is fine, he's just acting. Domingo raised his hand and motioned for me to be quiet. Then he asked another neighbor to go get the doctor who lived 2 houses away. Then the scream started again. Her! She's a monster! James screamed, pointing at me. Keep her away from me, please, 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 sir, he screamed, his eyes closed, leaning heavily on Uncle Domingo as if he needed his protection. Now everyone was staring at me. I couldn't hold back my tears anymore. They just started falling down my face. It was bad enough being mistreated by this kid in private, but now the people I had grown up with my whole life were looking at me as if I were some kind of tyrant. I just wanted to go home and hug my parents. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran to the entrance, flung the door open, and was surprised to see a police officer standing in front of me. Did the neighbors complain? Am I going to be arrested? I thought as I tried to control my racing heart. Is this the Peterson residence? He asked. I nodded. Are you the babysitter, Carol? He continued. I nodded again. I found him again. Where's James? He asked. I pointed to the future Oscar winner. For the first time I saw real fear in his eyes. The little rascal finally realized he had gone too far. I quickly explained to the officer what had happened, and it didn't take long for him to believe me. The brat couldn't even look him in the eye. Then the officer told me, "You two are coming with me to the station." Before I could say another word, a couple of officers escorted James and me to the police car. "Why are you taking me to the station, officer?" I didn't do anything wrong, I protested, but I was met with total silence. When we arrived, I saw Mr. and Mrs. Peterson at the station as well. I was shocked to see them behind bars. Also, they looked strangely dressed, wearing black clothes, very different from the fancy outfits they had worn to the concert. Then on the table, I saw a shotgun and other semi-automatic weapons wrapped in evidence bags. Finally, the realization started to sink in. These people were some kind of criminals. The officer came over to me and said, "Mr. and Mrs. Peterson have been arrested for attempting to rob a diamond dealer. They shot and injured people during the heist, so they're going to prison for a long time." I nodded. I looked at James, who was sitting on a bench at the other end of the hallway. He was staring off into space, lost in his own thoughts. I could see he was trying to process the consequences of what was about to happen. His life was about to change completely from now on. I sat down next to him on the bench and gently hugged him. He hugged me back and began to cry inconsolably. This is, without a doubt, the biggest secret my family ever kept. A secret that, when I discovered it, broke my heart and changed my life forever. My name is Clara. I'm 26 years old, and although today I am a strong and independent woman, it still hurts to remember everything I went through. I grew up in a small town in the interior of Argentina, in what many considered to be a perfect family. My father, a respected businessman, my mother, a serious and distant woman, and me, the only child who had always had everything she needed, or so I thought. But what I didn't know back then was that my life was built on a lie that would mark me forever. For as long as I can remember, Ramona was a constant presence in my life. Ramona was my nanny, but for me, she was always more than that. She raised me, cared for me, fed me, and held me at night when I was scared. She was a humble woman, illiterate, and always seemed a bit quiet, reserved. But her love for me was palpable. She cared for me as if I were her own daughter. I remember her rough, strong hands, hardened from working in the fields before coming to our house, and how they touched me with a tenderness I never knew from my own mother. My biological mother was always cold and distant with me. She loved me. I don't doubt that, but she was never affectionate. She gave me orders, she educated me, but love. I felt that from Ramona. My life with Ramona was always calm until I turned 17. It was then that I began to notice that something wasn't right. In my house, although everything seemed normal, there was a tense silence, as if we were all walking on eggshells. My parents had always been strict, but in those years I felt there was more than just discipline. My mother, always busy with her social commitments, seemed to pay even less attention to me than usual. My father, on the other hand, was authoritarian, distant, and I never really felt close to him. But as I grew older, I began to realize that, in fact, I didn't feel close to either of them. Ramona continued to care for me, even though I didn't need her as much as when I was a child. Despite being a teenager and able to do things on my own, She was always there, silently watching me with those sad but loving eyes. Something about her gaze touched me, but I never quite understood why. Sometimes I would catch her looking at me, as if she wanted to tell me something, but she always stayed quiet. Everything changed one summer afternoon, shortly after I turned 17. My parents were in the dining room arguing. It wasn't unusual for them to argue, but this time something in their tone made me stop. I was going upstairs to my room, but when I heard their voices, I stopped to listen. I didn't do it out of curiosity, but because something inside me told me I needed to. From the half-open door, I heard my mother's voice, firm but with a tremor I had never noticed before. "We can't keep this up, she's getting older," my mother said in an urgent whisper. "If she finds out, I don't know what she'd do." "She's not going to find out," my father replied more calmly, though with a stern tone. "What happened, happened. Ramona never knew anything, and Clara won't find out either." I felt my stomach twist into a knot. What were they talking about? What wasn't I supposed to know? I decided to back away and return to my room before they noticed me. I closed the door and stayed there, thinking, my heart pounding in my chest. Something wasn't right. My family, the one I thought was perfect, was hiding a secret I couldn't stop investigating. In the weeks that followed, that conversation kept replaying in my mind. I started noticing little details I hadn't before. How my mother avoided certain topics with me. How Ramona got nervous when I mentioned things about my childhood. How my father would change the subject whenever I asked about my grandparents or how they decided to adopt me. Something I had always known but never thought much about. One day I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I was in the kitchen with Ramona, who, as always, was washing the dishes after dinner. I looked at her, trying to control the tremor in my hands, and asked her directly, "Ramona, what are my parents hiding from me?" Ramona stopped washing the dishes and remained silent. I could see how her back tensed, how her hands tightened around the cloth she was holding. She didn't respond immediately, and when she did, her voice trembled. "Nothing, Clarita. What would they be hiding from you? Don't say silly things." But something in her tone told me she was lying. I stared at her and she avoided my gaze. Ramona was never good at lying. She never had been. "Ramona, please. I know something is going on. I heard them. I need to know the truth." Ramona let out a deep sigh and put the dishes down. She dried her hands with the cloth and finally sat down in front of me at the kitchen table. Her eyes, which had always been so tender and caring, were filled with sadness. She couldn't look at me directly, as if she couldn't find the words. "I don't know anything, Clarita," she said, but her voice broke at the end. I realized she was about to cry. Anger, frustration, and fear mixed inside me. What was going on? Why was Ramona, the person I trusted the most, lying to me? I got up from the table and left the kitchen without saying a word. I felt like everything around me was starting to fall apart. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept racing, trying to find answers. That's when I decided I couldn't keep waiting for someone to tell me the truth. I had to find it myself. I knew my father kept a locked drawer in his office, a place he had always told me I couldn't access. It took me days to find the key, but I finally found it in an old drawer in my mother's dressing room. With trembling hands, I opened the drawer. Inside, I found a series of old letters, some of which were addressed to my biological grandparents, Ramona's parents. At first, I didn't understand what I was reading, but as I went on, the horror of what I discovered hit me like a train. My biological grandparents, Ramona's parents, had sold their daughter, my biological mother, when she became pregnant at a very young age. They were a poor, rural family who didn't have the means to raise me. But the most terrible thing of all was discovering that Ramona hadn't just been a young single mother, but had been abused. The abuser was none other than my adoptive father's father, my adoptive grandfather. It had all been an arrangement between the two families. Ramona would give birth and my adoptive parents would raise me as their daughter. Ramona was told that her baby had died at birth, and years later they hired her to work as my nanny, without her ever knowing that the child she was caring for and loving as her own was, in fact, her biological daughter. Pain and betrayal consumed me. I didn't know how to process what I had just discovered. The people I thought were my family had lied to me my entire life. And Ramona, the woman who had raised me, who had loved me more than anyone, had been the victim of a cruel and manipulative system. My hands trembled as I held those letters, and I knew I had to tell Ramona the truth, even if it meant breaking her heart. That same night, I went to find her in her room. She was sitting on the bed, her hands in her lap, as if she knew something was coming. I sat next to her and showed her the letters. At first, she didn't understand what she was looking at, but when I read the contents out loud to her, her face changed. Sadness, despair, pain, everything took over her. "No, it can't be, Clarita," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "They told me my baby had died. They told me I'd never see her." Tears started falling down her face, and I couldn't hold back mine. We hugged, and in that moment, I knew our relationship had changed forever. Ramona wasn't just my nanny. She was my mother, the woman who had loved me more than anyone in the world, even though she hadn't known it herself. After that day, everything changed. When my adoptive parents found out I had discovered the truth, they tried to cover everything up as if nothing had happened, but they could no longer control the situation. I was no longer the naive girl they had raised under a facade of lies. The pain and anger I felt toward them were indescribable, but at the same time, confusion was eating me up inside. How could they have done something so cruel, so horrible? I remember the first confrontation I had with my adoptive father. I had waited all night to talk to him alone. My mother was in the kitchen, busy with her usual tasks, and Ramona had retreated to her room, still in shock over everything she had learned. My hands were shaking, and my heart was pounding, but I knew I couldn't stay silent. "Dad," I said, entering his office, the same place where I had found the letters, "I need to talk to you." He looked up from his papers with a calmness that made my nerves spike. It was as if nothing that had happened affected him in the least. "Clara, it's late. I don't think this is the right time to—" "I don't care what time it is," I interrupted him, using a tone I had never used with him before. "I know everything. I know what you did to Ramona. I know you've been lying to me my whole life." For the first time, I saw him lose his composure. His face, always so serene, tensed up. He set his papers aside and stood up, walking toward me with slow but firm steps. "You don't know what you're talking about," he replied with a coldness that made me shiver. "Everything we did was to protect you, Clara, to give you a life she could never have given you." "Protect me?" I nearly shouted. "You stole me from my mother. You lied to her. You made her believe her child was dead while you raised me like I was some object, your property. Ramona couldn't take care of you," he finally exploded. "She was a farm girl, uneducated, with nothing. She wouldn't have had the means to give you a decent life. What we did was for your own good." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. To them, I was nothing more than the result of a cold agreement, a transaction in which Ramona had been used and then discarded. My hands were trembling, but I tried to stay calm. "You abused Ramona, didn't you?" I asked, lowering my voice, but with a contained fury that threatened to explode. "You know she never wanted this. You know what you did to her." The silence that followed was deafening. My adoptive father looked at me with eyes full of a mixture of anger and something I had never seen in him before. Fear. "Don't ever say that again, Clara," he warned me. "You don't know what you're talking about. Everything we did was for your own good, and I'm not going to let you destroy this family over something you don't understand." The conversation was abruptly cut short when my mother entered the office. Seeing the two of us, she immediately knew something was wrong, but she didn't say anything. Her face showed the same fear and confusion as my father's. In that moment, I realized they would never admit the truth, never accept what they had done. To them, they would always be the heroes of a story they had invented themselves. But for me, the truth could no longer be ignored. I left the office with a knot in my chest and went to find Ramona. She was sitting in her room, still with tears in her eyes. I knelt beside her and took her hands in mine. "We have to leave, Ramona," I said, almost pleading. "We can't stay here, not anymore." Ramona looked at me, and for a moment I saw doubt in her eyes. Her whole life had revolved around working for my family, caring for me without knowing I was her daughter. She was a simple woman who couldn't read or write and had lived in ignorance of a truth that had destroyed her. "Where are we going to go, Clarita?" she asked, her voice broken. "I don't know, but we're going together. I don't care where, but we can't stay here." That night, we made the decision to leave. It was one of the hardest decisions I've ever had to make in my life, but I knew I couldn't keep living under the same roof with people who had lied to me, who had stolen everything from Ramona that she had the right to know. We left the next day with nothing but the clothes on our backs and moved to a small house in the countryside, in a nearby town. At first, everything was difficult. Ramona, although happy to be with me, still couldn't process everything she had discovered. I, for my part, struggled to move forward. I didn't have much money, but my biological grandparents, who, although they had sold me, seemed to have some kind of remorse, sent us a small sum of money each month. With that, at least we could survive. Ramona tried to keep working, but after everything that had happened, I couldn't let her remain enslaved in a job that had destroyed her. I promised myself that I would do everything possible so that she would never have to work again. I knew that after so much suffering, she deserved peace. In the following years, I studied with all my might to finish my degree in agricultural engineering. I wanted to give Ramona a better life, a life where we could live together without depending on anyone. It was difficult, but with effort and dedication I succeeded. Today, thank God, having graduated as an engineer, I can say that we have finally found the peace we had been searching for. Ramona no longer has to work, and together we've built a life where we can finally enjoy the relationship we should have always had. That of mother and daughter. We live in a small house we've made our own, surrounded by countryside, far from the pain and lies that once held us back. We take care of each other, and although the memories of the past still hurt, we know that the love we share is stronger than any lie. Sometimes Ramona tells me stories from when she was young, about her days in the fields, about how she always dreamed of being a mother. Every time she does, it pains me to think about what was stolen from her, about the years she lost believing her daughter had died. But it also comforts me to know that now we are together, and that she can finally live the life she always deserved. The past marked us, but it no longer defines us. Today, Ramona and I are free. Free to live, to laugh, to love each other as mother and daughter, as it should have always been. And although I will never forget what they did to me, the most important thing is that I am no longer alone. I have my real mother with me, and together we have found the peace that was so long denied to us. If you're reading this, I want you to know that the truth always finds its way. No matter how many lies are built around it, the truth will eventually come to light.